and welcome to Dialogue. Taiwan leader Lai Ching-te has once again escalated cross-strait tensions, labeling the Chinese mainland a foreign hostile force and openly revealing his separatist agenda by reiterating claims of Taiwan's so-called sovereignty. Speaking in Taipei on March 13th, just one day before the 20th anniversary of China's anti-secession law, Lai even suggested reinstituting a military court system to punish those who he deems pro-reunification with the motherland. So what's behind Lai's provocative rhetoric? And how do such inflammatory remarks impact the already delicate cross-strait relations? As the West further stokes tensions, most recently by undermining the One China principle in a Group of 7 statement, how serious could the consequences be? Join us for today's discussion live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Dr. Shao Yuqun, Senior Research Fellow at the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies, Dr. Joanna Lei, former Kuomintang legislator, and Benjamin Norton, founder and editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Welcome to Dialogue. Dr. Lei, I will start with you. So the Taiwan leader talked about, basically repeated what he used to say, like last year, at least on 2 occasions, he talked about Taiwan being a sovereign, independent nation, and the 2 sides of the Taiwan Strait are, quote, not subordinate to each other. Basically, like, on 2 sides, 2 countries, the theory. So what's the part that you think probably has the most important impact on cross-strait relations?
Certainly, the new statement on the 17 strategies has a very strong meaning in impacting the fundamental basis for the cross-strait relations. Some people said it's a preemptive move in response to the 20th anniversary of the Anti-Secession law. In addition to that, I think he also addressed to the increased tension between U.S. and PRC in the West Pacific, trying to regain the pivotal role of being a U.S. value partner and model democracy. And thirdly, he's to mobilize the anti-China DPP supporters within Taiwan's citizenship in a massive campaign to regain control of the legislative yuan by this massive recall action going on at this moment. So while the rhetoric may be similar, I think this is really momentous and a major turning point because he basically redefined the relationship across Taiwan Strait and in a very stated manner. It's not just implied, it's stated, and China is now being seen as a foreign hostile force. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, he has redefined people within Taiwan who promote peaceful resolution across Taiwan Straits as potentially being the operative of mainland China and potentially being, quote unquote, the enemy of the people.
You said his statement, especially calling the mainland, or here in this sense, he called China as a hostile force here. You said it changed fundamentally about the situation. Tell us more on that.
We had a de facto war since 1949, but we had a de facto peace after 1958 when the last bombshell dropped in Jinmen. So for the last years, many decades, we have managed peace across the Taiwan Straits with the understanding that we are a part of a bigger family. Also, starting from 1987-88, Taiwan eased the visitation right to mainland China, and for the 38 years, we managed to build relationship, people-to-people exchanges across the Taiwan Straits under the legal framework that we both recognize the One China, and in Taiwan, we recognize that there are 2 areas, mainland area and Taiwan area, and that was the basic of our legal framework to engage in cross-strait relations. So now if China is a hostile foreign entity, then certainly all these foundations will be shaken.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Shao, from the mainland's point of view, what's your response to Lai Ching-te's recent remarks?
I think it's one part of his overall aim during the next 4 years. I think his goal is to make Taiwan as a formal country on the island. He cannot do that internationally. It's impossible for him to do that. So his goal is do that domestically in Taiwan. And so his principle is to confront with the China, as he says, and then protect Taiwan. So if you look at his principle, what he has been doing is a part of the overall goal of his 4-year term. So besides his so-called preemptive action towards the March 14th symposium of anti-secession law, I think there's another part of his thinking. Basically, I think that TSMC's ongoing investment in the United States, President Trump announced that, and the DPP authority announced that too, and that made a lot of arguments, debates in Taiwan. So a lot of people oppose this kind of a deal, that they think DPP authority has actually betrayed Taiwan people's future. So within this context, I think Lai Ching-te and the DPP people, they want to do something to change the attention of the Taiwanese people and try to get the so-called their grasp the debates in order to let the debates to go into another direction.
Okay, to shift the public attention. Benjamin, right. You are an expert on the geopolitical economy. TSMC, the deal with Trump, and Trump said recently that instead of 100 billion, it's actually 200 billion investment in the U.S., including R&D center, in addition to fabs, of course, to produce chips there. The concern, of course, from the Taiwan's point of view, that is like, okay, the key technology will remain in Taiwan. But obviously, for Trump, his goal would to have as much as possible. Is that the case?
Absolutely. This is an extension of a policy that goes back several years. It's not just Trump, but Trump has definitely taken it in a new direction. So this has been referred to as a chip war. The United States, first under the original Trump administration and then also under Biden, imposed export restrictions on the Chinese mainland, trying to prevent the mainland from getting access to cutting-edge high-tech chips. And Taiwan, specifically TSMC, produces the majority of the world's most advanced chips. And Trump is essentially threatening tariffs. Of course, the U.S. already has very high tariffs on the mainland. There's been a lot of discussion of Trump removing or at least temporarily suspending the tariffs on Mexico and Canada. But although there's been discussion about that, there still are an average tariff rate of more than 30% on the mainland. And Trump is also threatening to put tariffs on Taiwan, and specifically over the issue of chips. He's essentially trying to threaten the Taiwanese to send TSMC essentially to make it a U.S. company. And this comes at the same time when the U.S. government is pushing a very aggressive policy, moving away from its alleged support for the One China policy. We saw that Marco Rubio, in particular, as Secretary of State, has taken a very aggressive line against the mainland. Under his leadership, the U.S. State Department has removed any reference to the One China policy. And you mentioned this very provocative, very aggressive G7 statement that was released a few days ago, in which the G7 also ended any reference to the One China policy. So unfortunately, what we see is a very extreme policy that's being promoted by Washington. And essentially, the U.S. is pushing for more and more tension, which incentivizes TSMC to invest in the U.S. So the U.S. will benefit, but the people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait will lose out.
Well, Dr. Lei, of course, if you look at the proposed so-called strategies against some of the behaviors, from the Lai Ching-te government, some of the the examples referred to, like Taiwan residents applying for identification documents in the mainland, or say it tends to raise so-called public awareness about risks associated with travel to the mainland. What's his goal? It looks like he's trying to prevent or block the people-to-people exchange across the straits.
Well, all those languages were commonplace when I was little. That was like 50 years ago. When I was little, those languages was used to describe a relationship or the threat of mainland China. So it is very clear that Lai Ching-te is using external threats to justify tightening internal control of the people, especially those who still believe that Cross-Strait can have a peaceful resolution, those who are working in concert with peacemakers across Taiwan Straits. Those people will be challenged or even threatened in these 17 strategies. In other words, he's tightening a lot of controls, depriving the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and even freedom of travel. And that is why former leader Ma Ying-jeou has claimed that this is an administrative dictatorship. He didn't say this lightly because he was the leader before, and he had seen the golden age when cross-strait agencies could deal with each other, and we have agreements signed directly agency to agency. So we've gone so far in fostering those relationships, and now it seems that Lai Ching-te will climb up and close some of the doors.
What about his idea for this reinstating this military court trial? Some people are afraid of like a martial law even being imposed across the island, Dr. Lei.
What the most direct impact on those is in the new drafting, because the United States has pushed the Taiwan government to increase its manpower in the military. So we will start redrafting young men, and this particular clause is directed to those who actually claim that they would not answer to the military draft. Now they will have to answer to that, otherwise they could be court-martialed. So I think all in all, Lai Ching-te is preparing for war and using external threats to tighten internal control of any dissidents who disagree with his Taiwan independence stance.
Well, Dr. Shao, we are talking about the people-to-people exchange. You know, I think everybody understands the importance of that kind of activity because it increases understanding. It will lead to ultimately, the purpose is for peaceful resolution of issues between the two sides. That's of course is from 1992, and then we reached the peak period of people-to-people exchange. Now, with efforts to block that kind of exchange, what will be the ultimate scenario if there's no people-to-people exchange? What will happen?
I think it's really dangerous if the two sides across the Taiwan Strait cannot freely exchange with each other and visit each other and try to understand the other's perspective. It's very important for both two sides to compare notes on certain issues, especially on the security and political issues. For example, I am a think tank expert on cross-strait relations and also China-US relations. So for me, it's very important for me to visit Taiwan and meet with my colleagues there to talk to them, to understand their views. But right now, and I guess they are also eager to meet with me in Taiwan and also in Shanghai to know our views here on the Chinese mainland. But right now, it's very difficult for me to visit Taiwan to just kind of academic exchanges. Even after the pandemic, just like 2 years right now, I just cannot visit Taiwan. And a lot of the Taiwan colleagues have told me that it's become more and more difficult for them to come to Shanghai and to have meetings together with us because all those threats coming from the DPP and the Lai Ching-te administration. So it's only a part of the story. The cross-strait exchanges are kind of a very comprehensive lot of things, but these days it's very, very difficult and actually the Chinese mainland, for example, Shanghai, the city has already announced that we are open to send tourists to Taiwan. But so far, we haven't heard anything from DPP side. So I think the overall strategy by Lai Ching-te and his people is try to decouple the relationship with the Chinese mainland in order to reach the goal, which is to make Taiwan as a normal country on the island. I think all those things serve for this final goal.
Yeah, of course, that's related to the Chinese anti-secession law. Earlier we mentioned 20th century. Tell us more about this law. Of course, it tries to prevent. I mean, if you look at it from the name, it prevents secessionist activities in the island. So what's the key let's say ideas behind the law?
Overall, I think there are at least two parts. First of all, it's a part of the overall modernization of the rule of law on the Chinese mainland, right? The second part is try to use this law to warn, deter, and also strike those Taiwan secessionists. So for the past 20 years, what we have seen is the Chinese mainland government actually would punish those Taiwan secessionists according to the anti-secession law. And if you go to the Taiwan Affairs Office website, you can find those names of the Taiwan secessionists and also those organizations. I think the policies have been quite successful. That the message, the strong message to contain, to deter those Taiwan secessionist forces are very strong. And I think that's one of the reasons why Lai Ching-te and his people would try to do a lot to stop this kind of a cross-strait relations.
Well, that's of course for the purpose of a peaceful resolution there. Benjamin, I mean, if you look at the situation, if there's a people-to-people exchange will be cut, and then more restrictions from the Taiwan side, and of course, if you look at this international situation, Taiwan being part of China is basically part of the fact, post-war so-called international order. And that cannot be changed. For China, that's just impossible to change that kind of order, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is international law. It says very clearly, it's not just the international order. I mean, the U.S. likes to talk about order as a replacement for international law, but let's look at the United Nations. Very clearly, the United Nations recognizes that there's one China, and Taiwan is part of China. In fact, earlier today, I was also looking at data from the International Monetary Fund, and you look and it says very clearly, Taiwan province of China. And all of these institutions, they recognize very clearly that Taiwan is part of China. And even the US government on paper recognizes that. What's very troubling, though, is that in recent years, it's not just under Trump, but especially under Marco Rubio with now the new Trump administration, the US has clearly been moving away from its rhetorical support for the one China policy and supporting very extremist forces that do not represent the majority of the people of Taiwan. Let's keep in mind that poll after poll shows that only a very small minority of extremists support secession, support separatism, whereas the vast majority, over 80%, want the status quo. And what does the status quo mean? It means that over time, as there's more interchange between the mainland and Taiwan, as there's more trade and economic integration, over time there will be peaceful reunification, which is why these extremist forces, unfortunately, with support from many people in the United States, they want to push the envelope and push for a more aggressive policy because they recognize they do not represent the majority. Time is not on their side. So instead, they're trying to increase tensions rather than reduce them.
Well, in that sense, Benjamin, of course, like Group of Seven recently, for the first time actually, they dropped the reference in their final statement about Taiwan, the statement of one China principle. We know how important that is. That's a cornerstone probably for a lot of people, peace and security, stability across the strait. I mean, if this reminds me of their, let's say, their policies on Ukraine. Although the situation is different, but you can compare probably. In the very beginning, there's a provocation, a so-called instigation to support Ukraine, to be part of NATO, right? To cut their relationship with Russia. Ultimately, it led to a war, led to military conflict, and Ukraine lost thousands of young men, hundreds of thousands probably, and possible loss of territory. It's a sad, sad story, a huge tragedy for Ukraine. Do you think people are learning any lessons? Right now, if you look at the West, they talk about supporting Taiwan, basically emboldening at least the separatist, pursuit or ambition to make Taiwan, somehow separate from the mainland.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think people, at least Western leaders, in particular in the United States, have learned the important lessons of this conflict. And you're right to point out that the people of Ukraine have lost an entire generation. And this war could have been avoided. It was entirely easy to avoid. But we saw that the United States, going back to 2014, was pushing this very aggressive policy that caused this war, and they continued fueling it. And of course, this is also, there are parallels, but in the case of Taiwan, it's even more extreme because according to international law, even according to the US itself, Taiwan is part of China. Ukraine is not part of Russia. And yet the US is pushing for an even more disastrous conflict. And in the case of Ukraine, now we see that Donald Trump is trying to impose a kind of unequal treaty, if you will, on Ukraine that would give the US at least control over half of the revenue coming from Ukraine's export of oil, gas, and critical minerals. This is actually also related to China because the US government is obsessed with trying to remove the mainland from global supply chains, especially for critical minerals, and to try to decouple the US economy from the mainland Chinese economy. And also, by the way, in this G7 statement, not only did they drop reference to the One China policy, but they also dropped reference to the previous statement that said that they do not want decoupling. So now they're essentially making it clear that they do want decoupling. So unfortunately, all of these policies we see coming out of Washington are pushing for more conflict as opposed to diplomacy and trade. I mean, if the US actually had a sensible policy based on peaceful coexistence and mutually beneficial win-win cooperation, I think that would be great. For me as an American and many other people, we would like to see that. We would love to, buy Chinese electric vehicles, which are much better and much cheaper. But unfortunately, basically everyone is losing out except a small handful of elites in Washington and a small handful of elites in Taiwan who do not represent the view of the majority of people in Taiwan and certainly people in Chinese mainland.
Well, Dr. Lei, if you look at the situation in Ukraine, basically, some people would say, oh, Russia and the US are carving up the country now. Russia got the territory, or the US got the minerals. So this is a very sad result there. But today, TSMC, for example, I know there's a debate, there's concern about whether basically all the critical technologies will be moved to the US, and then Taiwan will become less valuable, less important for the US, let's say?
Well, for TSMC, it makes sense for them to gain access to the Li market as well as the largest client base in the United States. But for Taiwan, not only will TSMC move to mainland China, to the United States in Arizona, but it also will bring probably around 80 satellite companies along with TSMC to the same location. In addition to that, they will bring about 2 generations of technology elites trained and honed their skills in TSMC to the United States. So it actually will, in a very real sense, hollow out some of the chip foundations built in Taiwan over many decades. In the White House statement, when asked if mainland China were to take Taiwan, what would happen to TSMC, what would happen to the United States, Trump simply answered that that is not a desirable situation, but if that happens, US will have many chips. So it is very clear that he's concerned about the security, the national security aspect of the United States is US will have its chips. But it has nothing to do with whether it will support Taiwan or whether they would have even the promises made by the previous Biden administration to support Taiwan in value, in being a democracy, and so on and so forth. So when Lai Ching-te continues to sing that old song made by Biden administration, I think he needs to really examine what Trump wants, and Trump has already gotten.
Well, Dr. Shao, if you look at the U.S. policy on China, of course, of which Taiwan is an important part of, that, on one hand, Trump himself showed that, he doesn't really care much about future reunification between the mainland and Taiwan. At the same time, you do have the U.S. government, in particular from the Congress, for example. At least 2 senators are trying to change the name of Taiwan office in the U.S. In a move to gradually to support so-called Taiwan independence over there. That's a separatist move, intolerable for China, obviously. How do you look at the U.S. policy? Do they have a clear policy right now? In the past, they call it like strategic vague, but what about now?
Right. First of all, for the U.S. Congress, all those bills, most of them will fail at the end of this year or next year. So it's not that serious. Secondly, about the Trump administration's policy, right now, I think all the focus of the administration is on Ukraine. And then I guess will be on Iran. And then these days, Houthis, right? They have a hit on the Houthis. And then I don't know when they will move their focus to the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific. And regarding the divisions within the Trump administration, President Trump has shown he's not that interested in the Taiwan security, but he's interested in the chips. And then we have seen national security hawks within his team, and then MAGA people within his team, and then Wall Street and the Silicon Valley people. So it's a mix. It's too early to say what Trump administration's policy towards China will be. Let's see until the beginning of next month, whether the so-called trade war will escalate or not. And then I would say that so far, the Trump administration is still based its policy towards Taiwan on the strategic ambiguous, I would say. And I don't think those State Department website, all those changes of the rhetorics, I don't think they have moved to the level of President Trump. But the State Department officials and National Security Council people, they would do what they battle or kind of a struggle within the Trump team. So let's wait and see.
Well, Dr. Lei, I wonder what's the public response to Lai Ching-te government's recent attempt to basically to sever the relationship or to further sever the relationship between the mainland and Taiwan, and that probably will lead to like a worse situation. Let's say, some would say as China continue to grow rapidly, technology, of course, defense sector, etc. So that's impossible. for Taiwan. Say to declare independence, to get separate from secessionists, to make their goal in a let's say in an unpeaceful way. If they want to resolve this issue in a non-peaceful resolution, that will not happen simply. So what's the public response? Do people really buy his idea?
Well, unfortunately, Taiwan is extremely bipolar. The polarizing forces has one side believing in the U.S. rhetoric of the old Biden administration, and also they believed in the promises now being retold by Lai Ching-te that the U.S. will support us, and the support is solid as rock. I think it is critical to also understand that the 17 strategies earmarking the 5 major sort of populations have already taken effect. People are getting very quiet. People are concerned about their securities and safeties. Some of the outspoken people have been investigated by the judicial forces. They've been asked to explain their actions. Even some of the people will be asked to be deported from Taiwan. So a lot of these actions, while they sound very unfamiliar because we have left the martial law area for a long period of time. We have not seen anything with such strong internal control, but the effect has already taken place. It has climbed up a lot of people who are now afraid to speak up.
Well, the fear and the chilling effect on the public, obviously. Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.